Good afternoon and welcome to the Cambridge Beer Festival online. This talk, probably for the next 57 minutes if you're lucky, is going to be all about the queer pub history of Cambridge. And I'm your host, Lisa, and I'm really pleased to welcome here with us this afternoon, haven't decided which, we have George Severs and Emma Inch. Thank you both for joining with us. They're both going to be talking a little bit about the history of queer pubs, generally and specifically about Cambridge. We had also hoped to be joined by David from Encompass Network. Unfortunately, he's not been able to make it, but thank you very much, and hopefully you're all aware of Encompass Network anyway. We'll talk more about them later. So, George has just finished his PhD at the University of Cambridge. He was exploring HIV/AIDS activism in England. He's also the secretary of the LGBTQ Special Interest Group of the UK Oral History Society, and he's the public history editor of the Oral History Journal. Welcome, George. Emma Inch is a multi-award-winning freelance writer and audio maker. I have to say I'm very pleased to be in the company of the former British Beer Writer of the Year. She has written for many publications nationally, and you can find out a lot more about her both during the next 50 odd minutes and online as well. So we're going to start, I think, with a little bit of history, I believe, because George, you're going to talk about the lesbian and gay pub scene in Cambridge from the 1970s, I believe. Is that a good place to start?
Sounds good to me. If you're happy to. Great. Thank you very much for having me. It's lovely to be here, and I mean, especially lovely to be here with the, as Lisa's already said, Emma, who's such an esteemed beer writer. Not something
you're making me blush here.
Not something I can claim to be, but not for want of trying. Cheers, everybody. As Lisa's just said, I'm going to talk. So I'll share some slides to make it slightly easier. And also to illustrate a few things to everybody. So I'm going to talk about, as I've said here, it's offer something of a history of Cambridge's gay pubs, and I've put here sort of because it's really, I mean, a cop-out is I think is unfair, but what I really want to illustrate, I think, is in the period that I'm looking at, my area of research focuses mainly on the late 20th century, the 1980s and the 1990s. And in that period, Cambridge is a very interesting example because whereas we have in that period, usually this is a period of kind of blossoming and in some cases booming leisure and drinking spaces for lesbian and gay people. We think, of course, of Manchester's Canal Street and the gay village in Manchester as one really good example of an area that really ballooned in the 80s and especially into the 90s. Cambridge is a very different example in that, as I'm going to perhaps suggest, some of the spaces that either were predominantly LGBT or queer, or had been certainly used by lesbian and gay people in Cambridge as spaces to socialise and to drink, and perhaps to organise as well. Those spaces really begin to be lost in this period, and because of that, you're left with fewer sources to talk about. And I think that history of absence is actually very interesting and is quite political and tells us something about why it is that spaces in general, but perhaps in this case pubs and bars and spaces of leisure in particular are so important, and why we need to really take them seriously and to really account for their absence. So I've put on the title slide here this image, which I think is wonderful just for its kind of wonderful kind of amateurishness, and I just think it's fun and happy, and it gives you a sense of the kind of queer joy that was experienced in the Cambridge gay group. This is a part of a sort of pamphlet to mark the 25th anniversary of the Cambridge Gay Group, which, as you can see here, was founded in 1970, and this marks that anniversary in 1995. What I think is, perhaps for our purposes, so useful about this image is that there are very few characters in this portrait that don't have a glass in their hand, or that don't have a beer bottle or a wine bottle next to them. There's a poor soul at the bottom right who has succumbed and is on the floor. But really what this image is trying to suggest, I think, is that, part of the history of those 25 years had been lesbians and gay men, bisexual and transgender people in Cambridge, socializing, enjoying each other's company, and meeting each other as LGBT individuals in spaces like pubs and bars. And that certainly is part of the story. And I've got a few images to show here that bring us to the start of what I want to talk about, which is the kind of the late 1970s in Cambridge. So this, I mean, I've no idea who is attending this talk. It'd be great to hear if people have any recollections of this kind of time. These are images that are taken from the Cambridgeshire County Record Office. And what I'm going to kind of flesh out here a little bit is a snapshot of the picture I've got from those records, because the Cambridgeshire County Records Office hold a really remarkable and wonderful collection of the Cambridge CHE, Campaign for Homosexual Equality, which the records they hold there are really remarkable. And I myself have only seen a really small snapshot, because some of you may know that these archives were originally at Shire Hall in Cambridge, and then they moved. That's when I saw the few sources that I've seen. They then moved to Ely, and no sooner had they kind of begun to start letting researchers in than COVID came. So I have seen, not all that this remarkable resource has to offer, but I think these pictures do a lot for us tonight by suggesting something of what it was like to be at what was at the time would have been, probably termed lesbian and gay, possibly even just gay night. This is the basement bar, the downstairs bar of the Anchor pub, which of course still exists and doesn't look like this anymore. But in the late 1970s, the Anchor bar, the downstairs of the Anchor, was one of several places that, I mean, these are not explicitly LGBT pubs in the way that we would think of something like the Admiral Duncan in Soho as being a gay pub that's gay owned and run for the interests of LGBT punters. But what the Anchor bar did was allowed, in quote, and that I think gets a sense of some of the power dynamics that start to form these relationships, allowed lesbian and gay nights to happen with relative frequency. It has to be said. These are events that happened throughout the year. When they were official kind of LGBT discos, the entry rate was 60 pence to get in, and this is money that would go to the Cambridge Gay Group or to Cambridge CHE, depending on who was running the evening. But I think these pictures are just remarkable because they're so dynamic and they give you a sense of maybe what it was like to be there. These are kind of smoky ale fueled nights at the Anchor. There's dancing, there is a lot of fun going on. What I think is particularly interesting about these images is these two in particular, they reveal to us, or they remind us, that this is not just, or perhaps even predominantly, a student event. This is a very the kinds of crowds we've got here are very intergenerational. We've got older men, we've got younger men. It reminds us as well, I suppose, that there are fewer women than there are men. There's a reason for this, and I again, to have had the actual source I wanted to check this on would have been good, but I'll explain later on that there's some movement of where these events were happening, because essentially what would happen is that when a new landlord took over a pub, if they were less sympathetic to having LGBT punters explicitly on a regular basis, they would just say, no, you're not coming in here anymore. But what happened, that was in one instance, I think this was at the Anchor pub, you have to forgive me, I can't remember the source, was that at one pub, a new landlord was quite happy for gay nights to carry on, but he was very keen that they not make this an explicitly lesbian event or a women's event, because he didn't think they would drink enough beer. we can have a think about whether that would be true another time. But that is the kind of misogynistic politics that many lesbian women were facing in Cambridge in the late 1970s. What I think is really important about this final image is the sense that we get that these were spaces in which friendships could be formed. These are spaces in which lovers would meet. These are spaces in which various forms of camaraderie occurred. So this, again, we have people of multiple genders and ages embracing in this photograph, whilst around them is a kind of, the hustle and bustle of the evening is going on. But this reminds us about the importance of that collective space. We don't know, well, I don't know who these people are. I showed some of these pictures at the launch of Dermot Hester's very good audio trail of Queer Cambridge, which if you haven't heard, is worth revisiting. And there were some men in the audience who, I think one was in one of these pictures and knew several of these individuals. But we, can imagine that people going to spaces like the basement bar of the Anchor, this may have been the first time that they had met other openly lesbian or gay people, and especially if these were students, coming up to Cambridge for the first time. This could have been a huge release and a huge kind of political and sexual awakening. And I think some of that is gotten across in these pictures. But as I mentioned earlier, these were very precarious spaces because of the fact they were not gay-owned businesses and they were not explicitly queer spaces. So when pubs changed hands, that could often spell the end for long-standing lesbian and gay venues. And this was the case for the Anchor bar. When a new landlord took over, again, you'll have to forgive me, I'm a very bad historian, I can't remember the date, but the pub changes hands. And the new landlord is not happy for this regular disco that was going on to carry on. It's worth saying that this doesn't rob lesbian and gay Cambridge of a queer space. There are regular discos also happening in a number of college bars, particularly King's College and St John's College. This is in the late 70s and the 80s. And it's really remarkable that there is there's much less of a town gown, horrible expression, I think, but much less of a town gown divide than is often implied. This could just be the sense you get from what's available, but certainly those college-hosted lesbian and gay sort of pub nights are advertised and reported on in the CHE newsletter, and that's much more of a kind of town populated organization at this time. So it's not the only space, but it's crucial that this is a space that's not dominated by the university. That meant that people could come and go more freely. You don't have a kind of surly porter in your way trying to get through to a lesbian and gay night. There are also, of course, lots of different legal issues at this time, right? That we've mentioned the fact that there are people of many different ages here, all of whom will have been over 18. But at this time, this is in the late 1970s, the age of consent for gay men, of course, is 21, and for heterosexual people, it's less than that, 18 or 16, depending on when we're talking about. So there are legal issues to be going on about there. But crucially, the Anchor pub also provided a space where certain lesbian and gay newspapers could be sold. The Anchor, for much of that time in the 70s, would sell the CHE newsletter. So it's a kind of really important almost municipal space. It's not dominated by the university that queer people had access to until this change of hands occurred. And what this does is leaves regular people who rely on this space for their social life, really, that sort of social lifeline, in a very vulnerable position, either because socialization then has to occur elsewhere. And this is the case when the Anchor changes hands, because a new venue is found somewhere on Hills Road. And it's not because of the new venue, but very shortly after this venue becomes the sort of new home of this disco, there's a really horrible kind of homophobic attack on people who are leaving that bar by members of, it's reported by members of a nearby kind of barracks. And this gets resolved, but it puts people who had just lost their, what is thought of as their kind of home in the anchor, it puts them really on the back foot, and you sense a real loss of confidence and a real kind of fear becoming palpable in what's being written at the start of the 1980s, because these spaces were starting to be lost. And we see this, it's not perhaps very clear, this is a report from the Cambridge Campaign for Homosexual Equality from 1987. You can see again that they have, that the HQ here is on Hills Road also. But one of the items on this list in the newsletter is the Lesbian and Gay Venue Group. And it reads here, the struggle for a decent nightlife in Cambridge continues on February the 10th at St Philip's School, where there's going to be a meeting, basically a demonstration. So by 1987, it's perfectly clear that lesbian and gay venues are not only declining, but they're at risk of really not existing anymore.
Sorry, George, I'm just going to interrupt then, because you're actually kind of moving into my era, and I was out and about in the pubs in Cambridge in 1987, and yeah, I can tell you that that's definitely how it felt, that there was a lack of space. It was
perfect.
Yeah, there was not much information, and especially as someone who didn't live actually in the town, it was very hard to find out what was going on.
Great, that's really helpful. And was that because I actually can't see anyone's faces, but who was that speaking?
It's Lisa.
Lisa, thank you, Lisa. Lisa, how am I for time?
It's just gone 18 minutes past, so you've got a few more minutes. I don't know if Emma wants to pick up anything that you've said so far, or whether you want to continue.
No, go ahead and continue, George. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely fascinating. Oh, well done, David. You just put up the URL for the Queer Cambridge audio trail.
Oh, thank you. Okay, let me just say some few things then to kind of round off. So it's not a terribly happy story, as you can see how this is going. I'm hoping Emma's going to have more. Well, we know Emma has some more fun clips to play us. But let me just say then why this is so important. I think this is this again is likely to resonate with you both. But the reason that this lack of a gay venue was perhaps so important in this year, 1987. 87 has been pointed to as perhaps the kind of epicenter, or the it's a really crucial, really terrifying year during the AIDS crisis. You know, large numbers of people are dying, and it's around this time that we get the "Don't Die of Ignorance" advert. So this, you know, AIDS is very much on the agenda, and it matters in that context that there are no, or there are fewer and fewer and fewer lesbian and gay venues that are explicitly known as such, because it meant that information was very hard to come by in those spaces. For example, this is part of a report that the Cambridge AIDS working group that's run between Adam Brooks and a number of, I think Shay as well, but a number of Cambridge-based gay activist groups and the university put together, and they wanted to know why it was, where students are likely to go if they needed more information. And you'll see that there's leisure spaces, queer spaces, pubs are not even an option. Whether this is because they didn't know to ask is unclear, but it's very telling that top of the list is the Cambridge AIDS helpline. So local based stuff is important to people who want more information about AIDS, but those pubs just are not available to people. This is really a striking contrast between that's just a very similar kind of stat there, which I'm going to jump over. This is a real contrast to what's going on elsewhere. So again, in Manchester, this is a postcard that was available at a number of gay venues in and around the gay village in Manchester about where you could get more information, and crucially where you could get safer sex paraphernalia. And all of these little dots on the screen, all of those are lesbian and gay pubs and bars. And so you can see there the fact that this is not only by 1987, not only a really important loss in terms of social life and in terms of that kind of social validation that you get from being in a queer space, but information, the public health information is becoming less available for that reason, because those spaces are not there. And to just conclude this then, this is really unclear, so I will just explain what it is. This is the log, if you like, or a kind of report about the calls that had been made to Cambridge CHE's helpline. And amongst the most popular call that week, 3, was people asking, are there any gay pubs in Cambridge? So 3 years after that kind of protest about the fact that Cambridge gay spaces were being lost, by 1990, some people at least, didn't even know if there were any or not. So I'm hoping that Emma has a happier note to end on, but I will just say that it's not just it's not a sad story, I think, but it's one that reminds us why we need these spaces. They're not only spaces to have fun in. That's really, really important, of course, because, as I say, it gives us that sense of validation. But we feel this so particularly now in a COVID context that, you know, we need spaces where inclusive public health information can be accessed. And the AIDS crisis reminds us that in a number of contexts, LGBT pubs and clubs were those spaces. So that's why we need to really ensure that they have a very healthy revival once we're able to go into them safely.
Thanks, George. That was really, really interesting. And from a personal point of view, having grown up around Cambridge and been a teenager in the late 80s, it's really interesting to realise what was going on kind of without me knowing as a sort of 16, 17-year-old. Thank you. Emma, are you happy to take it away?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, George. That was so interesting, and it's really interesting as like a sort of a kind of microcosm of some of the stuff that I've been working on. It's a really good example of the importance of those places. So I'll just say thank you to Cambridge Beer Festival for inviting me to come. I was at Cambridge Beer Festival in 2019. I'm still drinking out my little glass here, and hope to be with everybody again another time. But I've sort of stepped in at the last minute, which was very lucky, in fact, because this is the kind of stuff I'm working on at the moment. I'm working on a 3-part audio series for Cameras Learn and Discover part of their website, which will go live, I believe, on June the 11th. And it's about sort of it's a kind of a personal history of gay pubs, queer pubs, and LGBT spaces, and bringing in kind of loads of the stuff that George just talked about. I've been, taking notes down of all the things that resonate with what I've been looking at. So the audio series I'm making is called Passion, Pride and Protest. I must remember to get those words in the right order. So it's called Passion, Pride and Protest, which are the when I started my research and started interviewing people for the documentary, those were the kind of 3 main themes that came up, and they came up really clearly in what George was just saying. So that, sort of the passion element is around the stuff you were saying. You had that lovely photo of people with their arms around each other. It's not just about meeting lovers, but about making friends, about meeting people. I mean, I had a very big birthday last year, and was just coming out around 1987. And I remember when I first started going to gay pubs, I'd not, to my knowledge, not met a single gay person. I didn't know anyone. I didn't know anyone who was queer. And of course, there was no internet. There was no way of me getting in touch with people or seeing people. And pubs were the place where I went to and met some people who were kind of like me, and kind of we shared some kind of common goals kind of thing. And that kind of, when I started talking to people about particularly people my age or older, about those first steps into LGBT pubs, there was a lot of this fear, and you spoke about that there, George, as well, and particularly fear around the year you were talking about, 1987, 88. Section 28 was just coming in. Thatcher had said that people don't have this inalienable right to be gay. That people mustn't be talked about. It mustn't be promoted as a valid lifestyle. And that was sort of the sort of toe I dipped my foot, the lake that I dipped my toe into. I'm mixing my metaphors here. Anyway, that was what I was entering, and there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of fear, self-hatred, as well as real fear around violence and attacks. And I spoke to a few people who had been attacked leaving venues, and some people who were attacked actually in the venues by straight people coming in. But the thing that came up with that theme of passion was this, yes, you're going to be brave, but what the heck else are you going to do? one person was quoted as, well, I'm not going to sit in my bedroom just carrying on writing poetry to a woman who doesn't fancy me. I've got to get out. I've got to just do something. There was no other option. And the pubs were this, this amazing resource for people when there was basically nothing else. The second kind of element of what I've been looking at is pride. And part of that is kind of about pride as we talk about pride events. But mostly I was thinking about some of the stuff George was saying about our validation, self-validation, and seeing ourselves in other people, linked to that fact that I didn't know anyone who was queer, and lots of people I spoke to didn't know anyone until they went to pubs. There was no role models, and no, nobody to show us how to be, and it was only in the pubs that you found that. Interesting, you use the word intergenerational, because I've used that in my piece as well, that how important those, the intergenerational levels are in terms of helping people grow in their queer identity, particularly as some of us are rejected by our families or leave our families in search of other gay people. That we don't have that kind of intergenerational links within our homes. We have to find them elsewhere, and people very much felt that they found those in pubs, and that that was so important to people. This kind of role model, this kind of building identity, safe spaces. I talked a lot about safety in the piece, and but also very much that recognition that the history that we tell ourselves sometimes, and that also came across in your photos and in what you said about lesbians not being welcome because they don't drink enough beer. Thinking about that some of these spaces, although they're safe for some members of the community, are not safe for other members who also fall under that umbrella of LGBT. And we see that, particularly when we're talking about Black and minority ethnic communities, or trans communities, and non-binary communities, and particularly now when the LGBT community is under attack. Yet again, we thought we'd done this work in the late 80s, and we're doing it again, standing side by side with our trans siblings. That kind of support and safety of a space was incredibly important for people. But at the same time, it's kind of the stuff that you were describing around sort of. I don't think you can understand gay pubs until you get to grips with that legislation and what was happening at different times, and what meant that we had to be in these secret spaces. And that nowadays there's this kind of pride. I think of this bar in Brighton called Legends that has a terrace out the front of it, right on the seafront. And, the idea is that you're seen at Legends, by people driving by or walking by. You're right there on the sun terrace having your drink. That is so opposite to when I started going to gay pubs, when it was, you ring a doorbell, you get let in, you get judged whether you're coming in or not. And then you go down into a basement with blacked out windows, and then you look twice when you leave. You don't order a cab to the venue. You walk somewhere else and pretend you've been somewhere else. So yeah, that kind of pride that has developed in the community in the face of so much prejudice. And then the third element, as I said, is protest. That's what I've been talking about as well, and linked to all that stuff about legislation. And linked to what you were saying, George, about partying. Partying is really important for our identity. That this kind of hedonism that is often considered to be part of gay nightlife. Yes, we need that hedonism. We definitely need it, and particularly at dark times, we definitely need that time to celebrate each other, and to make space for each other, and to give each other mutual support. But also, queer pubs have always been, for me and for many people, a place of the things that you were saying were lacking in Cambridge, a place of public health information during the AIDS crisis, around information about all sorts of things. You'd go to the pub to pick up your gay newspapers. You'd go to the pub to find out about demonstrations. You'd go to the pub to find out about Pride. You couldn't find out about it elsewhere, because there wasn't elsewhere. There wasn't a phone in your pocket that had everything on it. And I sort of remember, and I spoke to a number of people. One of the people I spoke to is Amy LeMay, the London's night czar, who said this thing about, pubs. Yes, they're a place for us to kind of celebrate, but they also give us our political mojo. They kind of get us going with, with bringing things to us in terms of information and allowing us to meet and link up with people. And of course, that's even more important now. And it's interesting that you talk about closures as well, because of course, you're talking about that period of time in Cambridge when lots of pubs were closing. But of course, we're in that situation again now. And I looked at some very interesting research from Ben Campkin. Oops, sorry, I bet that was really loud on the audio. I'm an audio maker, I don't generally punch my mic. So I looked at this really interesting research by Ben Campkin, who's at UCL. And he's looked at some of the reasons why pubs are closing. And he looked at sort of queer pubs between 2006 and 2017. The number of queer venues, LGBTQI venues, fell by 58% in those years between 2006, 2017. 58% loss of venues. Of course, not all of those venues were pubs. Some were, like you say, sort of spaces in kind of otherwise straight venues. And of course, we all know that pubs are closing, and it's terrifying, the amount. But that was 58% compared to mainstream venues were closing at a rate of 25%. So it was more than double. It was more than double the rate. And kind of, he kind of looked at what the reasons might be for that. And I think some of the media mainstream reasons that are given for that are things like, well, people are using dating apps now. They're all on Grindr. They don't need to go to the pub. Or, the world is so accepting now. We don't need gay pubs. We all go to straight pubs and it's absolutely fine. And both of those reasons were kind of, both those reasons are flawed in different ways. But actually, they actually came up. That wasn't, the evidence they found. That wasn't the reason why these places were closing. It wasn't for those reasons. Some of the places that were closing were extremely popular. Were still being frequented by people. It wasn't due to a lack of interest. The main three reasons why things were closing was threat of development, rise in commercial rents, and a rise in business rates. Those were the reasons why things were closing. The same as what happens to other pubs, but unfortunately, queer spaces have tended to be, and you use the word as well, George, but in these precarious positions. They're in precarious locations. So either they rely on, people who aren't in the LGBT community to host those events, or the bricks and mortar that queer people might be running themselves and owning themselves are often in, sort of precarious places that are again, as Amy LeMay said, LGBT people are risk takers. We go into new areas and we, break new ground, and create areas. And unfortunately, we can accidentally be part of the gentrification process ourselves and find that we're then priced out of those areas. And so I think, I think some of that is depressing and worrying. But there was also a lot of positivity, a lot of love for pubs. And I think amongst the people I spoke to, and particularly, as you were saying, at this particular time, the pandemic and, finding ourselves in this digital world, not in a face-to-face world, maybe we realize that how much we do value that, and how much we do still need that, and how much we do still need the company of others. What I can do is I do have a clip of the so this podcast it's not a podcast. Don't say podcast. Camera has their own podcast. It's an audio documentary series, and it's going to be on the Learn and Discover pages of the website. I've got a clip I can play you of the introduction.
That'd be great if you could play us that, Emma. That would be grand.
Excellent. So let me see. How did I do this? No, I remember how to do it now. I went to the video thing, and there we go. So I'll play you. This is just a couple of minutes of the introduction to the first episode, and it just gives you a little flavour of the people I spoke to and the kinds of things that they were saying. Passion, pride and protest. A personal history of queer pubs. Episode 1. Passion.
they are essential. Queer pubs, queer bars, queer clubs are essential in our history because they're spaces where magic things happen, where love and rivalries and arguments and whatever, snogs, first dates, they're the crucible where all of our wonderful things happen.
Once you were actually behind the door, you felt really special. You know, you felt like you were this kind of, you'd made it finally into a place where you could meet people like you. You know, you weren't just sort of sitting in your bedroom writing poetry about some woman who didn't fancy you. You were actually in a club with all these other people you could talk to and be open with about it, and also, you know, you might actually meet someone who could at least dance with somebody.
The chances to go and meet people and connect with people are made much easier in a pub. Also, having a pint or two definitely helps take the edge off things and eases those social interactions and increases our chances of meeting people, I suppose, and having a chat at the bar to someone. You never know who you're going to meet. They might be an idiot. They might also be your next great love, or both.
You know, it's a place where we meet friends, where we meet partners, where we break up with partners, where, we dance the night away.
I've had straight friends complain to me about all the snogging and touching that sometimes goes on in kind of gay venues. And initially I saw their point, and then after a while I just thought, you don't really realise your privilege of being able to do those things, hold someone's hand, snog them. You don't realise the privilege of being able to do those things in a pub or on any street corner without ending up in hospital.
Okay, so that hopefully gives you a little flavour of the kind of stuff that that's going to be in the series, and is obviously freely available to camera members. So just a rundown of the few people I spoke to there. The first guy who was saying how essential pubs are, that's David Shepherd, who he's a community activist, but he was also the former publican at the former manager of the Marlborough Pub and Theatre in Brighton, which has become an amazing space for all sexualities, all genders, and actually was the focal point of Trans Pride, the first Trans Pride in the country. I also spoke to Jill Gardner, who's written a book about the Gateways Club in London. She was the second person who spoke about, she was speaking about trying to get into these clubs and trying to get into private members' clubs. And she's written this book about the Gateways, which by the time it closed was the longest running lesbian club in the world, and was in Chelsea in London, and ran from, I think, around 1931 to 1985. And you might know it from The Killing of Sister George. It appeared in that film. Another person I spoke to, the one who said you might meet your greatest love or a complete idiot, or it might be both. We've all been there. That's Cathy Caton, who's she's the founder of Brighton Gin, but she's also a radio broadcaster and has had a queer show in Brighton for a long time. And then you heard the voice of Amy LeMay, who's London's night czar, works alongside the Mayor of London in so trying to preserve our nightlife, including queer nightlife, and they've done a lot of work along that. And you heard from Alf Lafloic, who's a queer historian, who was talking about, there's still this risk around being attacked if you're showing public displays of affection outside of pubs, and showing how important those spaces are. So hopefully that gives you kind of a little flavour of some of the people that I spoke to and some of the things that we'll be covering. And I think I'll stop. All right, I used to work in radio, so I can just talk until the news starts. Or I could just now.
Should I activate the pips, Emma? Ready for the news? Sadly, we don't have any pips, but I just have to come and say that was fascinating. It was nice to get a taste of the audio documentary, not a podcast. That will be brilliant. And as Emma says, that's going to be available to camera members on the website. I found everything that you both had to say really fascinating. I think David's just popped So David is the guy who's making all of this magic happen for us this evening. He's just popped up the URL for Learn and Discover, where you can find Emma's audio documentary from the 11th of June next month. We have got a few questions that have come in. So Emma and George, if you've got a couple of minutes, we'll address a couple of those. So we've got one coming from Rob saying, do you have a favourite LGBT+ pub or venue? I think in Cambridge that's quite a difficult question these days, because there's not much choice.
So is Rob asking particularly about Cambridge?
No, he's just asking generally. Somebody has then later on said, what about in Cambridge? But I think just generally, if you've got a favourite somewhere, share it.
Well, yeah, unfortunately, I don't know the Cambridge scene. I mean, it's recording this series, particularly in the way I've had to record it, not face to face, not meeting people in pubs, for obvious reasons. It's absolutely made me long for so many venues. The Marlborough, which I just mentioned, the Bedford Tavern in Brighton is also a really welcoming kind of family community. It really that idea of like a queer family embracing you comes across very strongly in some stuff that Kathy Caton talks about in the documentary. And also I when I was talking to Amy LeMay, she used to work at First Out in London. I don't know if anybody remembers that. It was it's right by Centrepoint. It now no longer exists, but it was one of those places at the time that had it was just much more at a time when things were very dark and underground. First Out was much more welcoming. It had full-length windows. It was a cafe bar upstairs. It was like a vegetarian cafe upstairs, and you could go and sit in the cafe bar. And then if you felt brave, you could go downstairs and get yourself a beer and sit in the sort of dark basement downstairs. And places like that. But it's made my heart break and also sing for these venues, and wanting to go back and support them as much as we can.
I think that's one of the key things at the moment, isn't it? We need to support all of our venues, regardless. What about you, George? Is there somewhere that you'd like to be heading right this moment?
It's interesting to think on it, because I have never lived anywhere that had like a really an established even one gay pub. I'm originally from Basingstoke, which did have a gay pub for ages, and it closed. I think I was probably 17 when it closed, which I think is really unfair. And then moved to Egham in Surrey, and now live in Cambridge, which has of course got like bars in which you can find this, but there's no nowadays. There's not that kind of single gay pub. So places that have kind of, I suppose, that have special memories, I suppose, or that are good places that are close to home. So the Edge in Southampton is a club that has been many a fun night had there. I mentioned the Admiral Duncan in London earlier, which is again somewhere I like, and I think is also somewhere that needs our support. And that before I started working on HIV, I was working on the history of the origins and the origins of kind of anti-gay far right prejudices, and the Admiral Duncan plays a big part in that, because of course it was nail bombed by a fascist terrorist in 1999, David Copeland. And so that, I think, just entering that space and knowing it still exists as a queer space, there's something really kind of political, and that always feels like quite a powerful moment to be able to enter that where someone really didn't want you to be. So that those would be mine. Yeah.
Well, I have to say that there's been a couple of responses to this coming in from Facebook, etc., from the audience, and Ashley has actually named one of their favourite spaces as Cambridge Beer Festival. So thank you very much, Ashley, for that. And also given a shout out for Out for Blood for the Queer Horror Film Festival. Now that sounds like an interesting night out. So I've got another question in here. I'm going to answer it very boringly. I'll go first, and then hopefully Emma and George can up the ante a bit, which is, So it's just popped off then. So Rob has asked, what's everyone drinking? And sadly, Rob, I'm going to say I've got a glass of water. I just wasn't prepared. Emma, what about you? I know you've been supping something nice out of a Cambridge Beer Festival glass.
Oh, I have, yeah. Well, I've dived into two actually, which is probably a bit bad. But one of them was a table beer, so I got one of the camera boxes, you know, of the different beer stars boxes. So I dug into that, and I got New Barnes table beer, which is the first New Barnes one I've had. I've heard a lot about them. That's very nice. And now I'm on a Boxcar Dark Mild, which I must admit is absolutely hitting the spot. But both of them less than 3.6%, so that's good.
Very nice, very nice. George, what about you? Have you joined me on the water, or have you plunged into a beer?
I haven't. I've got a beer, and I was really hoping you wouldn't ask, because it's really disappointing. I know that my big camera family are the Hickey family in Basingstoke. My friend Tom and his dad, who are diehard camera members, and that they would be very disappointed to know that I'm just drinking a Moretti. It's a lager, but it's because it's been a busy week, and that's what Sainsbury's had on the shop. But yeah. One thing that has been very good, I've recently moved slightly outside of Cambridge to somewhere where there was a very good Morrison's nearby, and they have a really super. I found. I mean, other supermarkets are available. I don't know if we're supposed to. It's been great to try some of their ales. So, but this is just a
just a quick, just warm and wet on a sunny evening. Why not?
Quite.
So Rob has joined in and with a hurrah for Dark Mild there, Emma. So that's great. I'm just going to pick up, there's another question from Pat. He mentions that they went to their first Dock Cotton in 1997, which used to be at the Junction, and he's asking, have they found a new venue? And I have to say, I don't know. And I know from David, our magician behind the scenes, is also saying he doesn't know the answer to the question. If anyone knows, would they please get in touch and tell us what's going on? If there is going to be a new venue for post-COVID, that would be amazing to think that Dock Cotton is still going. I genuinely don't remember where my wife's first one was, but yeah, it was probably around the same kind of mark as Pat's, I have to say. I can't see any other questions coming in at the moment. I do have to ask Emma and George, do you have any questions for each other?
I have loads for George, but probably should do that over a pint.
Yeah, I think that's maybe yeah. We don't want to keep everyone from their beer for too long.
I think the stuff that you've been studying is so interesting. I mean, I do have another clip if there's time for that. I don't know whether you want to go on to questions or.
We haven't got any other questions that have come in at the moment. So if you want to play another clip, we've got a few minutes. You can do that.
So always prepared. So I do have a clip of Jill Gardner, who was speaking on the introduction to the documentary that I played you a minute ago. She wrote this book about the gateways, as I said, and she just gave this kind of fascinating kind of idea of what that might be, what that might have been like, kind of going to the gateways. And let me just share this. So this is her talking, part of an interview that I did with her, talking about the gateways, which, as I say, was ran from 1931 to 1985 in Chelsea in London, and was women only from mid to late 60s.
Well, it was in Chelsea. The entrance was in Bramham Street. It was in a basement. Seems to have been opened by 1931, as far as I could find out. But it started as an arty bohemian club, so it was frequented by a lot of Chelsea artists. And lesbians found that they were welcome there. There was one particularly important occasion when Ted Ware, who owned it by 1943, had a male customer who was visiting a couple of the gay women there, because gay service women were going there during the war, and gay women apparently in Chelsea were going there in the 30s before the war. On one occasion, there was a straight man hassling a couple of the lesbians, and Ted threw him out. He didn't throw them out, and so word got round, that it was safe to be yourself there, and that he was very happy with gay women as his clientele. it didn't become women only until 1967, but it was overwhelmingly frequented by women, increasingly in the 40s, 50s, late 40s, 50s, and 60s, because they felt it was. They often said that the only place they could go, by which they meant not that it was the only venue where you could ever dance with your girlfriend, because there would be odd nights at different other venues, but the Gateways was open every night, and indeed in the 50s in the afternoons, and also very often at Saturday and Sunday lunchtime. So if you just felt like dropping into your kind of lesbian local, the Gateways was always there. It's basically a basement of a house in Ramerton Street, and not huge either. I can't remember the exact measurements now, but if you think of a typical basement of a fairly large but terraced house, it was that sort of size. It was very smoky in the 60s and 70s. Well, indeed, I just think throughout its history. The iconic experience of going there is you had to knock on the door first of all to get entry. Someone would open a grill and just ask you, "Are you a member?" And if you weren't a member, you had to really talk your way in, or you might not be allowed in at all. Someone had to sign you in if it was your first visit, because in members' clubs you had to be approved by existing members. And but once you were in there, you walked down the stairs, and all eyes turned to you as you were going down the stairs, sizing you up. That could be quite an intimidating experience, especially the first time, but also quite a thrill. You've got all these women looking at you, and you've come to meet other gay women. That was quite a moment. Then there would be dancing and drinking. There would be conversation, but the music was generally on pretty loud, so that dancing was the main thing that people did. But I think what was just so exciting about it was just liberating to be able to go into a space where you could be yourself and not be hassled by straight men, and just meet other women like you. Obviously, if you were looking for a girlfriend, or if it was your first time ever going to a gay venue, then it was an opportunity to try and meet people. I can't see myself. I never really made a close friendship from a gay club, but people did get into relationships. Eyes would meet across the room, and if two women fancied each other, they'd end up dancing together, and then that might sometimes lead to going home together, even on the first date, because first night. Because how else did you meet people? It was quite tough at the time.
Oh, thanks very much for sharing that, Emma. It's fascinating insight there from Jill into Gateways. I'm afraid we're kind of running out of time. I just want to pick up, there's been a bit of chat on that question that we had from Pat about Doc Cotton and a new venue. So they did move to the Fez, but the Fez is now shut, which was a bar near the train station in Cambridge. And then there's also, I believe they had one event in January 2020, Martin says, just before the pandemic hit. And because it had moved from the junction to the Q Club, but we'll see if anyone can bring us up to date with what might be happening afterwards. Please do let us know. And Pat was also posed another question, which is very pertinent for us, which is, when is Queer Beers back? So we can't go without mentioning Queer Beers, which is organised by Encompass Network, and is hosted by the Fort St George and the Hop and Grain Store. I always have to concentrate on that name. I believe the Fort used to be was the second Saturday of the month, and then it was at the Hop and Grain Store on the fourth Friday. We do know that they're hoping to restart. We don't have any particular details at the moment, but if you go to the website, the URL's on the screen at the moment, you can sign up for the newsletter, so you'll get all of the information hot off the press, so to speak. So thanks to everyone for their questions, and thank you most importantly to Emma Inch and George Severs for joining us and sharing some of their insights and knowledge into the history of queer pubs and queer spaces for drinking and meeting people, and also, as both of you have highlighted, and is so important now, is for having that community space and the opportunity to talk to people. That's invaluable, and as we've highlighted on at the moment, it's even more important. It's not just having those queer spaces, but also making sure that our pubs survive. I also want to say thank you to David, who's doing all the magic behind everything and making this happen for us this evening. And also to the Cambridge Beer Festival Online this year for giving us the opportunity to share this talk. There are more events from the Cambridge Beer Festival. Yes, it's online, it's not in a big marquee or anything in a space on Jesus Green, but there's a lot happening. You can see the URL, check out what's going on there. Tomorrow, there is the Discover British Beer Styles, and I'm told you can still order the beer in time to join in with that. If you want to keep up to date with what's coming up in the future, other events and indeed future beer festivals, again, please keep an eye on our social media and check out the website. There's another, David's just put the Twitter and Instagram up on there as well. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. Also have to say thank you very much to GearStet, who are sponsoring this. And thank you to all of you who've listened in, taken part, popped a question on, and to all of you who might then go and watch it. I believe it's still going to be on YouTube to watch afterwards as well. So thank you very much to everyone for joining in. Have a lovely Thursday Beer Festival evening.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.